Hey there, the project that we have for you in the upcoming lessons is going to be an infinite scroll or an endless scroll. And that means that we're going to continuously load more content on the page whenever the user is visiting the page and they're going down and they see that they're hitting the end, and it's going to load more additional content. So as the content is available, it's going to continue to load content onto the page for the user to see. And this is all going to be done with JavaScript. Fetch request to an endpoint and returning back the content that's associated with that endpoint. My name is Lawrence. I'm going to be your instructor for this course. I come to you with many years of web development experience, and I'm so excited to be able to present this project for you today. So the idea for this project comes from a number of students that have asked me how they can create this type of effect where they're able to load content from an external source and load it into their page and seamlessly present it to users within their page. I'm going to be walking you through how you can create the same effect step by step, starting from a blank HTML page that we're going to simulate a typical website where we've got some content at the top, main content area, and then footer content, and then have the content load dynamically as the user scrolls to the bottom of the page. So we're picking up the position of the user using the window on scroll event. And then when that gets triggered, it's going to run a function that's going to make a fetch request to the URL, return it as JSON, and then we're going to go through that JSON data within JavaScript and then output that onto the page. If you have any questions or comments, I'm always happy to help answer them within the Q&A section. Please be aware that there are some prerequisites to this course. So HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are all prerequisites to the course, as the scope of the upcoming lessons is focused on making the AJAX request using fetch and then outputting the content into the DOM using JavaScript. Yes, I do suggest that you work alongside the lessons to create your own version of this project. I'm going to be using brackets as my editor of choice. I've got it opened up here on the left-hand side, and then I'm minimizing a browser window on the right-hand side so that we can see the output of the page content onto the display area here on the right-hand side. I'm also going to be making use of Chrome, and Chrome is the browser I'm using, so the developer tools in Chrome, outputting content into the console so that we can track the values that are being created using JavaScript. So again, all of the source code is included, so do try it out for yourself. I know you're excited to get started, so let's dive right in and start creating this project. Hey, in this lesson, we're going to be setting up the basic HTML web page and also looking at the data that we're going to be requesting using the AJAX request that's going to be loading onto the page. So first of all, I've created an index.html file, so it's completely blank. Just created it, and I'm using brackets to load the live preview. And if you are using brackets, that's just under here under File, Live Preview. And you don't necessarily need to do with the local machine, but it's always better when you're connecting to various APIs that you are using the HTTP protocol over the file protocol. And the file protocol is the one that you just go over to the index file, find it on your system, and open it within the browser, and that will give you the file and the path where it's located on your computer. So if you do have the opportunity, make sure that you do have an option for local machine, and this will make sure that your web APIs connect a lot smoother. And in this case, this particular one, this is an API that I've set up, and this endpoint is running from a Google script, and it's returning back a bunch of course content that I have. So it's got a listing of all the courses that I have, and it's essentially a feed of all the course content. And this is the API that we're going to be working with. Also keep in mind that APIs could vary, so there might be some differences within the APIs. And this particular one, it's going to have at the bottom, it's going to have pages, previous, null, next to. So this will give us the ability to go through the various pages of content. And there are quite a few different pages of content. We've got a status of 200 that's being returned, and then all of the data. So this is the content that we're going to output on the page and we're going to use within the page. Now you're welcome to connect to another API, another different endpoint, or you can use the one that I'm going to be highlighting within the course. I'll include a link for that within the code, within the JavaScript code. And also keep in mind that APIs will vary. So this particular one is always going to be looking for additional pages, and it's going to load the pages in chunks. So you might have an API where you can query each item and then move to the next item, move to the next item. So this is all depending on what the API is that you're looking at. So now we're just going to set up a basic HTML page and create some HTML structure. So we've got a title, we've got a head here, and then within the body, we're going to have a head section, so a header, and this is going to be all of top content, and have a section, and this is where all of the main content will go. And when we load the page initially, we're going to take the first page of data and we're going to load it within the main content area. And it's also going to need to have the ability to scroll the content in order for this to work. So if you don't have enough content on your page to make it scroll, to see the scroll bar, then this isn't going to work, because we're going to be waiting for the scroll bar to hit the bottom. And if it doesn't have an option to go down to the bottom, then you're not going to be able to load any additional content. So that's the one thing to keep in mind. And you can also focus it on various sections, but in this case, we're going to be building out for the entire web page. Let's add in a little bit of styling so we can have some size to the content that we're loading, and set up the header. And of course, you can customize this as needed. I'm just setting up a real basic setup for some content for a web page. Also, we're going to do the header, the footer. It's going to be very similar to the header with some differences. And this is, of course, footer. And the main content is just contained within section. So we'll give the section some height as well. So it's got some minimum height, and there right away we already have the scroll bar there at the side. So that's good enough for the styling for now. And then we're going to be loading the content into this main section. So I'm going to give it a class of container, so that using JavaScript we can select this particular section in case we add additional sections into the project. And then lastly, let's link out to a script file and have a source, and then we'll create the script file. So the source will be, we'll call it app.js, and this is where all the magic is going to happen. This is where we're going to be loading the JavaScript content, and you can of course customize the HTML and the styling as needed, and it isn't the focus really of the upcoming lessons, as we do want to focus on JavaScript. So the upcoming lessons are going to be strictly JavaScript, and we're going to entirely focus on the contents of JavaScript. So that's coming up in the next lesson. We're going to work with the app.js, and I'll just create that as a placeholder, so completely blank file, app.js, and make sure that it's linked. So I usually like to do an alert just so that I ensure that my JavaScript file is linked. And there we get the pop-up. So we're all good to go to move on to the next lesson. So go ahead and set up your project and get ready to move to the JavaScript sections, and that's coming up next. Now we're going to look at JavaScript, and the first thing that we want to do is load the content. So as mentioned in the earlier lesson, I do have an endpoint that I've set up, and this is actually going to be a custom one that's going to list out all of my course content. So the data, within the data object, it's got a number of posts, and then the posts contain each different information about courses and so on. And then also within the main level, there's the pages, and if there's a previous page, it'll list it here and also list out the next page, so that I have a way to move through the various pages of content, and I'm going to load them chunk by chunk. So I'll load page by page, and this will vary per API. So first thing we want to do is set up the URL. So that's not going to change, and I'm going to set it up as a variable called just URL. And I'll make this a little bit smaller so we can see it. I know this is a fairly long URL, and this is coming from an apps script. So you can use the same one that I'm using. And if you go out into your browser and paste it, you're going to find that you get status, but the data is false because there's no data that's being returned because we haven't specified a page. And that's one of the parameters that this particular API is looking for, is that it's looking for a value. So let's create that, and we're going to create an object that's just going to be called val. And then this is what we're going to be updating in the various functions as we move through the various pages that are available within this particular API. So we want to set up a page value, and I'm just going to call it page. And this is going to be our starting page value. So we can start at page 1 because this is actually where the API is going to start. So the start page is 1. And next, we're going to create a function that's going to make the fetch request to the URL and return the content so that we can loop through the content and we can see it within the console. So let's create a function and we can call it get courses. And so this will run right off within the root. And you could also have specific triggers that will load this as needed. And we're going to be updating this later on, that the trigger is going to be loading the course content whenever we do the scroll. So that's going to be, we're going to be customizing some of the functions. And that's why it's always good to wrap it within a function, because this is going to make it more flexible. So the get courses function and setting up a fetch request. So let's build the base URL for the fetch request and set up that. And this isn't actually going to change once we set it. So we'll just call it the base URL. It's going to use the value of URL and then concatenate the question mark equals and question mark page equals, and then whatever the page value is that we want to load. And that's connected within the val object under page. So that will provide us a base URL that we can work with. And next, we're going to create the fetch request. So we're using fetch instead of the XHR request. You can also do this with the XHR request, of course. So using fetch, and this is promise based. So we're returning back our response value on this promise. So returning back a response. And when we do get the response, we're going to use the JSON, the response JSON, and send that to the next promise, and that will be then. And now we're going to have it within a usable format where we've got it as a JSON value that's being returned in a usable format. And for now, we'll just console log out the contents of JSON to make sure that we've done the connection properly and that everything is working as expected. So refresh the page, and we're not going to see anything yet within the web page, but if we open up the console, and that's down here at the bottom, I am using Chrome, so this is a dev tool within Chrome. And if you're not familiar with the console, you can always open that up within the More Tools developer tools, and there's different shortcuts for Windows and for Macs. So we see we get return back an object. So this is representing the JSON content, and within that object we've got a status of 200, we've got data of a number of different posts, and then we've got the pages. So we're only looking to get back the contents that are contained within JSON data object. So let's do a quick refresh, and now we see we've got the posts, which is what we're going to loop through. And the pages are going to indicate if there's additional content to be loaded, and if it is available to load, then we know that when we're scrolling, we can continue to load more content as long as there's a next page. And if next is null, then we have to stop loading content. So we have to be mindful of that fact. So once you've set up your fetch request and you've got access to the data, and you can also open it in the browser just to see that you are getting the data, and it'll be the same thing that you're returning back within the console. You're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson. We're going to make use of this content and we're going to write it into the web page. So that's still to come in the next lesson. This lesson, we're going to output the content of the data object that's being returned back from the fetch request, and we're going to write it onto the page. So let's create a few more variables. I'm going to create a variable called page. This is going to be an object that can hold our page contents, and it provides us some flexibility if we want to provide a page container. And here I'm going to just use a document and create element. And the element that I'm going to create is just going to be a regular div. And this is where we're going to dump the page contents. And I'm also going to use the page main object and then document, and this is where we're going to select the main object that we want to post the content into. So I don't have to actually create one because I do have that section with the class of container. So let's use query selector, and we're going to select the section object. And if you do have more than one section, the query selector will select the first one. And now we can use page, and here we're going to append, and the content that we're going to append is contained within page container. And let's give some content into the page container. So the page container, and set up some inner text or text content. And I'll set that to be hello world. So we're going to dump in within the page container. We're going to append it with the contents of hello world. So it looks like we're ready, and we've got this page container that we can write content into. So next, let's create a function in order to handle that. And I'll just create the function up here. And what this function is going to do is this is the one that's actually going to render the posts. So we could call it render posts, and then it needs some data that's going to loop through and render the posts. And it's going to be expecting an array object so that we've got the data, and using for each, we're going to loop through the contents of it, and each one of these is going to be a post. And then here, just as we did before, we're going to create a temporary div. So using the document create element and creating a div. This is going to be the main container for each one of the posts. So as we loop through the posts, we're going to output the divs, and we see that we've got a number of posts there. So all we're going to have to do is use the render posts and output the content of JSON data and posts, because it's going to be expecting an array. So we're sending all of that object information into here, and now we're rendering out the posts. So we haven't written anything out yet. So let's take the div, and we're going to use the inner HTML method, and I'll update some of the content that's contained within the post. Let's take a look at the post structure. So they are array based. So each one of them, as we loop through, I've got a title here for within the array structure. So you also might find that it's an object within these types of APIs, but in this particular case, it's just an array value. So the post is going to be an array value. So we'll use the template literal, so the curly brackets, and then the $ post, and then whatever index number it is, the value that we want to output. So it looks like maybe we should output the contents of 8, and then taking the page container and then using the append method, we're going to append the div to the page. And I got the $ on the wrong side there. So now we're outputting the content from the API. And this is a template literal, so these are backticks. They're not actually single quotes. So make sure that you are pressing the backtick, and that's beside the 1 key, to the left of the 1 key on your keyboard or on most keyboards. So template literals, and then to call a variable value in, then we use the $, the curly brackets, and then whatever the value is that we want to use from the JavaScript code. So it looks like we're able to load that content, and we're going to add some more structure to this coming up, as well as add another element at the bottom that's just going to say that there's more content to be loaded. So whenever the person scrolls down to the bottom, they'll see this, that, oh, it's loading, and it'll load more content into the bottom part there. So that's coming up next. So there's quite a few things that we need to still do in the upcoming lessons. So go ahead, connect to the API, render the content from the API onto your web page, and you'll be ready to move on to the next lesson. Hey, welcome back. In this lesson, we're going to look at the scroll event with the window object. When we scroll down, we want to load additional content. So there's a few variables that we have to set up, as well as listening for the event of the scroll on the window in order to pick up that event action from taking place, and then we can load the content accordingly. So there's one thing that I did want to note. So I am using append. So this is very similar, or pretty much the same thing as append child. So with ES6, we got introduced, and we have the option to append and prepend. So this is an option, and if you find that maybe you're using an older browser, or you might be having some issues with append, you can always update this to append child. And I'll just do a quick update of it, and when we reload it, it's going to do the same thing. So it's just appending a node, whereas the append appends the entire element, and it still puts it in the same spot, which is inserts the node after the last element of the parent. So this is going to be doing the same thing, and there are some browser compatibility issues. So append child will work across all the different browsers, and append will only work with some of the newer versions of Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Opera, and Safari. And it's not going to work on Internet Explorer, or it doesn't have support for Edge. So keeping that in mind, I'll switch this back to append, and let's get on with the lesson where we're going to look at listening for the event, so the scroll event. So this is a window event object, and using the window object, so this is by default loaded whenever you load content into the window. So every web page will have a window object, and we're going to listen for the on scroll event. And this is an event that will be called whenever the window is scrolled. And if the window is scrolled, we're going to assign it to an anonymous function. That's going to just, for now, will console log out the EV value, which is the event value. So whenever it's being scrolled, and let me get back onto the console, we can see if I clear it, and if I scroll, every time we're scrolling, we're registering this event. So its type is a scroll event, and there's a bunch of information here as well. The source element is the document. So you can place that on a particular element as well for the scroll. But in this case, we want to scroll the entire page because we're listening for the entire page. And whenever anyone is at near the bottom of the page or at the bottom of the page, we want to load additional content. So that's the way that we want this scroller to work. So we're going to also offset it by the height. And within the window object itself, there's a few values that are available for us. So when we do console log window, we can get the inner height. So this is the number of pixels in the browser window viewport, including if rendered on the horizontal bar. So this is that whole inner content that's available. So when we load it, and if I change the window height, you're going to see that that value is also changing correspondingly. So that's going to be an important one because we want to know how much space we have to work with. And now it's going to be 151, so it's way smaller. So because this is all the space that we have within the window inner height. And that's the value that we want to look at. And we also want to compare that to where the scroll position. So that's another value that's sitting within the window object. And that's going to be determined by where the scroll value of y is going to be sitting. So the scroll value of y is the number of pixels that the document has already been scrolled vertically. So this gives us an indication of how far we are scrolled already vertically. So let's load that, and we'll clear and load it again. And this one is going to be scroll. So we need to specify whether it's scroll y or scroll x. And we can see now we're at 510. When I scroll down, it's 850, 2077. So this is going to give us an idea of where we are, and combine this with the amount of inner height to the scrolled, how far we are. We're going to know how far off the page we've already scrolled. So looking at one more value that we need to look at in this equation is the document body. And this is the element that we want to track. And it's got a value of offset height. So this is the height of an element relative to its element parent, offset parent. So we're going to take that value and log that as well. So all of these values are going to be important. And as you see, the further down I scroll, we can see that the inner height stays the same. The scroll y, which is the window where it's how far it's scrolled on the page, is there. And then the other value that we're looking at is the offset height. So this is the height of this object, and it includes how much we've scrolled down. So taking these three numbers, we can come up with the formula to determine how close to the bottom of the page the user is, and this allows us to load the content. So let's do that, where we're going to load additional content, and we're going to do a condition for this. And we're going to take these values that we've got, the window height, inner height. We're going to add it to the window scroll y. And as you can see, this is going to produce the same number that we have, or very similar to what we have as the complete document body offset. And we're going to check to see if this value, so we'll add those together first. And we're going to check to see if it's greater than or equal to. And then this value here is going to be the document body offset. So this is the element that we're looking at and where it's being positioned on the entire body. And this value is going to return back. And we need to subtract a little bit off of it. And this is how many pixels off the bottom you want to do the scroll action on it. So I'm going to do minus 300. And this is adjustable as needed. And then if it's good, then we're going to do a console log, and this is where we're going to do the scrolling. And that's where we're going to handle the scrolling action. So let's see, and we aren't at the bottom yet, and you can see there by the scroll bar, so it is very small there. On the right hand side, the tiny scroll bar, and now you see we've gotten to the bottom, so we want to add the additional content whenever we're at the bottom. And so this can be adjusted, and you don't have to use the document body. You can use the container that we've got as well, so the page main, and we could track how far this is off the bottom. So, and I'll just duplicate that in the console. And there's a lot of numbers, of course, that we can work with. And that's again was the document body. So this is obviously the entire page element. And see, there is a difference, of course, between the values. So this one might be a little bit more harder to calculate if we're doing the page main, because then we have to account for the heading there and adding that in and everything together. So that one by default, it's already going to be sitting at slightly higher because it's not accounting for the footer section, which was 500 or 480 pixels. So it's not accounting for that. So that's what we have to always consider, and as well as padding and so on. So there's a number of other additional variables at play. So usually when I do this, I do stick with the document body offset height, but you are able to use any one of the elements that you want on the page. And coming up next, then we're going to hook up the rest of the requests, making the fetch requests whenever we're ready to do additional scrolling. So that's still to come in the upcoming lesson. So set up your window on scroll event and launch the function whenever it's rolling with the condition, and you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson. This lesson is going to be really important because this is where we're going to set the ability to scroll and make another AJAX request. And I'm going to create a variable called page loader more and set this to true. So this is going to give us the ability to load additional content, and we don't want to make additional AJAX requests if there's no more content to load. So this is going to keep track of when we're able to load more content. And as mentioned earlier, from the pages value, we know that if there's additional content to load. So we know that if pages next is null, then we've loaded all of the pages of content and there's nothing additional to load. So if I was to load page 15, and if I refresh, I get the object back and I get pages. So next 16, let's try a larger number. And eventually we're going to get to where it says pages next is going to be null. So that's what we're actually looking for. So we can actually start on any page that we want. And I'm guessing there's probably around 20 pages or so. So when we hit the 20 pages, we don't want any more scrolling action to happen. And this is why we've set up the page loader more to true, because by default, we want to try to load at least one time. And if there's nothing to load, then we're going to just stop the loading altogether. And that means that we've loaded all the available content on the page that we need to use. So going back into the window on scroll event object, this is where we can check to see, and also this will lock out additional loads of the content. So we're going to set it to false, and we're going to check to see if it's true, and that means that we can set our AJAX request, and then immediately we're going to set that to false so that we don't have multiple requests, AJAX requests. And so this can also be something that can be problematic, because if you load multiple AJAX requests, you might skip pages and you might be missing some of the content. So let's create a function, add new posts. So this will run whenever we're at the bottom of the page, whenever the scrolling is ready. I'm also going to block out the console messages because we don't need those anymore, as we've already gone through those values and what they mean. Let's set up that function that we're calling to, that new posts function. And so this is going to actually control what the value of the page is. And we are starting with page 1. So that means that we're loading a content there in the get courses. And every time we add new posts, so whenever we're calling this function, we want to update the value that's contained within the page so that we can actually move to the following page. And that was under the object val and page. So we're going to just increment it by 1. So that will allow us to move to the new page, because whenever we're calling the URL, we're updating the page value. And that's the way this API works, is that we can update page values and call the next page. And then we're calling to get courses. And I'm going to also update this one to be first load, as this is just going to be the first request. So it's going to get the course value, and also want to clear out the contents of the container. You don't have to do this, except I've got the hello world in there. So I'm just going to clear out whatever is contained within there. And then of course, this of course is a function. So let's save that. And now we should have that content cleared out on the first run. So let's do a refresh. And it should actually be calling the first load function. So just save that. And so what it did is it cleared out that hello world or any content that might be sitting within the content area, and it allowed us to load. And then whenever we get to the bottom, we want to be calling the next set of content and loading, and once again at the bottom and call more content. So make another AJAX request. So we need to be able to handle that. And the reason it's not loading anything else is because the page load more is still false. So that means that we need to set it to true. And this is where we can do the check whenever we're adding the posts within that function. This is where we can check to see if the page is, if there's more pages of content. So we've got that within the get posts function. And I'll move this one up so it's closer to here where we're using the value. And so we'll do a quick check to see if, and going into the data, we've got JSON data pages, and the pages object has next. So it's JSON data pages next is not equal to null, then we know that we can load more content. And so that means that we'll update the load more to be true. So that allows us to load more content, and that means that when we get to the end, then we're not going to load any more additional content, and we'll console log out the page object. So clear, and let's scroll down. And whenever we get to the bottom, we're going to load more content, and the page object is back to true. So that means that we can load more content once again. And there's more content loading, and it does take a while to load, so we should have something in there that indicates that the loading is taking place. I'll update the page value to 17, and we'll try to load some content at this part. And what's happening now is that we're not loading any more content because the page object is going to stay at false because there's no more content to load. So it does one time, it stays at false, and it doesn't load any additional content. So that's exactly what we want to happen. So we can set this back to page 1. And this is also depending on what your API is doing. So you might have different ways of handling this. Last thing we need to do to wrap this up, so everything looks like it's loading more content when we get to the bottom. We need to have something that's indicating to the user that there's more content that's being loaded. So you see right now the way that it's working is it's loading the content. So right now we're over here and it loads that content, but there's no indication to the user that there's more content coming and that's being loaded. So let's handle that, where we're going to add a little indicator there at the bottom that's going to say that there's more content coming, and we can add that in over here to scroll down to add more content, and we can add that to the bottom, or we can create a new element and add that in the section and constantly update that. So there's a number of ways to do that. So let's take care of that coming up in the next lesson. Hey, welcome back. How's your project coming along? So we are loading content. We're making AJAX requests, and we're continuously loading new content onto the page. And I've opened up the Elements Inspector for Google Chrome in order to see what's actually happening here within the page content. So when I refresh it and go into the section container, the main content, this is where we're loading the content into. And as we scroll down, so when we scroll down to the bottom of the page, we're continuously loading additional content into that element. So going down to the bottom, it will load more content, more divs. So we want to have a message area to the user so that they know what's happening. And the message area we can place just outside of this div. So if we add it to the section, this is an ideal spot for this. And I'm going to create it as an element. And the reason I'm doing this is because we're going to continuously reload it. So I'm going to call it page message, and using the document create element, creating an element and create a div. And then within the page message, we can have some text content. So text, and this will update, and then we'll also update the styling, hiding and showing this element. So page message text content, scroll to load more content. And I'll put some dashes there. And you could also use like a scroll, a loader, or something else as well. So just going back into the page, let's do a page refresh. And we've got our main content. And then we go to the bottom of it, and we need to still add that in. So we need to append that message container to the main page main. So go into the bottom, and we're doing it underneath when we append the container. And the reason is because we want it to actually sit underneath. So page message element is going to be added in underneath. If we do it on top, then it will add in on top, and it's obviously not going to make any sense to be added in on the top. So now when we scroll down, we've got scroll to load more content, and then that disappears, scroll to load more content. So we need to make it more flexible as well, because we might not have more content to load. So that means that if it is null, then we need to just clear out the content. So how about we update the contents of page message, and whenever we load, whenever we make the request to get courses and get content, and we make the fetch request, we're going to update this to have text, and we're going to overwrite the existing content. So text content is loading, and I'll do a bunch of dots there so the user knows that something is happening. So we've got loading, and then this will, or should change, so we need to change it back as well. So once we reset this to true, we can change it back to that initial message. And you could add this as a variable, so you don't have to keep retyping it. So that's another option. Or if you want to customize those messages, so I can say whatever page we're on, page, and then I'll include the page number. So I'm going to do it this way, where I'm concatenating the page number, or we've got the value of page. You can also do it in a template literal, so that the user knows that what we're actually loading. So we've got loading, and then if we scroll down, but if we don't get quite to the bottom, we'll see that there was page 3 and page 4. So I keep scrolling a little bit too fast. So I'm going to do it slower, and we should be able to see the message just before it scrolls additional content. So we've got page scroll, page 5, scroll to load more content. And we could say something like scroll down to load more content, or whatever. So now that we've got this value, and if it's not, then what we want to do is we're going to keep the page loader to false, but it already is false coming in. But we should update this to, we could actually hide this. So we could apply a style of display none. Or we could have a message that everything is loaded. So it's up to you, however you want to handle that. So I'll keep it at none. And then let's change page to 15, and we'll see what page we're loading. And that's it. So it's not going to load anything past that. We'll try that one more time. So loading, and we scroll down, and we should see what page we're on. And then if we do get to the bottom of all of the available content, then we're not going to have any message anymore. So it's going to add the display none. So that's going to be added in there. So there's a number of ways to handle this, and it's up to you how you want to do this as well. Every time you load a page, you could add in some additional content into the post message area, or you could update as well with when you're creating the elements before you're appending. So you could have some additional inner HTML there between different posts if you wanted to. And you can also update every time you do the request to have additional content between the HTML elements. This lesson is going to be a conclusion to this project where we're loading content dynamically, and as the user scrolls down, we're going to load additional content until there's no more content to load, and then we're just going to disappear the message block from the user's view. And you can see that when you do the inspect, that we still have that message area that says loading, but it's got display none. And you can customize this to act however you need it to act. I'm going to reset this back to page 1. So that's our initial first page, so that that first page loads properly and all of the functionality is there. So there's quite a bit that you can do to still tweak this application. And of course, depending on what type of content and how you want to output the content, there's you can practice as well with what's being returned back in this API, and then customize it for your own purposes within your own API. So this one is just an array-based that's being returned back. So it's an array within an array, and each one of these array items has a particular piece of content. So there's a description, there's more like kind of a headline there, and there's a link to where the course is located. That's the number of reviews, that's the rating, that's when it was created, and so on. So there's some additional information that can be added in. So if you wanted to, you could customize this, and I'll do a quick customization with adding in some more content. And as we're doing the inner HTML, this is a template literal, so we can do spaces, and that will bring us to the next line. And if we want to have some additional content, all we have to do is use the $ in the curly brackets to bring additional variables into this. So we can say that this, so number 5 is the rating. So using the post index 5 stars by, and then we can have another value, students, and maybe we want to do an HR here to separate the posts. So it looks a little bit different, and you can play around with the content that's being returned, and so now it looks a little bit better. You can also include URLs and hyperlinks, so if we want to view the content to a href and link it to wherever the URL is. So if you're linking out to some content, and you might also want to have another title here. So you could add in the hyperlinks that way. And it's all coming from the API. So again, they will vary depending on what you're getting returned back from the API. So this one, maybe it's 0. And then we've got number 2 there, so post 2. So now we're linking out. We've got a title for each one. We've got the rating and so on. So we've got all of that information is being appended there. So just a quick overview of how we set up this application. So we started out by a basic HTML structure. We added in some height for the header and footer to simulate some type of web page content that might potentially be added onto the page. So make this a little bit bigger, and we've got our top content there, and then all of this content is going to continuously load as the user scrolls down. They get a quick message there that says loading as it's loading additional content on the page, and then when it runs out of content to load, so it's just loading them by the chunks of pages. And we just got some basic HTML structure, so the 3 main elements there, the header, the section, and the footer. And then JavaScript is doing all of the behind the scenes work where it's connecting to so it's using the URL, connecting to a web endpoint that requires a page value, so that's provided with p equals whatever the page value is. So we're starting our page off at 1, and we're incrementing those pages as we load more content. So we have new content that's being presented for the user. We created a main variable called page. So this is a main object where we can load the page information. So that's loading more, message, and the different element containers that we constructed. And then we've got this first load function that's clearing out the inner HTML from the page container, and then it's running a function called get courses. And this is where all of really the stuff happens, is that we take the URL, we make our fetch request, return back it as JSON, we check to see if there's more pages. If there's more pages, then we re-enable the ability to load it on the scroll. We also provide some text content back to the user. If there's no more pages to load, then we're going to end the loading, and we just hide the message element, and all of the content is still loaded there. We've got a few console messages here that we're using on debugging. So these can be blocked out, so you don't have to have these, of course. And as you're debugging your application, you're going to want to use the console log in order to make sure that you've got your variables and your data picked up properly. Then we're invoking a function called render post, which is the one that actually builds the HTML. So everything is broken apart. We also have one that listens for the on window scroll event object. We looked at the variables that we needed to consider when we're trying to figure out where we're positioned on the page and where the user is positioned on the page. And then once we do that calculation, if the condition is met, then we load more content. So we do the add new posts. And what add new posts does is it's the same thing as get courses, but we're incrementing the page value so that we get the new page. So then we're running the function get posts or get courses, which is getting all of the post information. And then lastly, the render the post was the one that is constructing the content, the visible content for the user. So we're looping through all of the data. So this has to be as an array object that gets passed into the render posts so that it can render the posts out, taking out the structure, which we saw that it's another array inside of there. So just depending on what the index values are, we can return back the associated values. And then once we construct the inner HTML, we just append a new div to the main page container, and we continuously loop through until there's no more posts available within the data that was sent to the render posts. If you have any questions or comments, I'm always happy to help. I've included all the source code, and I do encourage you to try it out for yourself, connect to other endpoints, and update the values, and make sure that you can load the content, and use console log, of course, to see how the data is structured so that you can get the appropriate values. And keep in mind as well that it could vary. So you might not always have the page increments. You might have different posts by numbers, and then you'd have to check to see if there's values there that's being returned back. So there's a number of different ways that this could be handled, and it all depends on the API and how the JSON object is being returned back from the API endpoint. Thanks again for taking this course in this section, and I'll see you in the next one.